Hey everyone, today we're doing a quick post-mortem on some key points regarding Intel Alder Lake. This is stuff that Patrick and I have compiled over the last several days of just sort of working on Alder Lake follow-up coverage, reading comments online, and following along as reviewers, as Intel, as Microsoft, all discover various, maybe not always issues, but anomalies or unique behaviors relating to Intel's 12th gen of CPUs. In this video, we'll be talking about VBS and default settings, DRM issues causing games to not launch, to crash, to not work at all in some instances, BIOS and power limits and some of the changes there that Intel has made, PCIe Gen5, cooler support, and a couple of other things. Before that, this video is brought to you by ASUS and the ROG Crosshair 8 series of X570 motherboards for AMD. ASUS has both the Crosshair 8 Hero Dark and the Crosshair 8 Extreme available, offering high-end motherboards for high core count AMD systems. We've used the Crosshair series for years, for everything from basic overclocking up to liquid nitrogen overclocking, and we found them easy to work with, particularly for their extremely well-organized BIOS menus. Learn more at the link in the description below. So the format for this video is a bit more casual. It is moderately scripted, but we haven't gone crazy with it. And the goal is to go over some of the hot topics from the past couple of days as we've had more time to dig in and learn more about things beyond focusing on running tests, collecting data, and presenting it. One of the key topics is VBS. That's come up a lot in especially the Windows 10 versus 11 benchmarks. This is something we're going to focus on today, but if you want to skip around, this video is topical. It's not chronological. So we're going to have time bars on the screen. I think on this side, feel free to jump ahead to the one you care about. VBS, you should probably listen in on though. So virtualization-based security, or VBS, became a central point in discussions of Windows 10 versus 11. Part of the reason it was central, if you aren't familiar with VBS, you haven't heard the three letters together before relating to this, that's okay. This is a new topic, at least. It's been around, VBS has been around a little while, since Windows 10 especially, but it hasn't really come up in performance discussions. The reason it's coming up now is this is something that Intel has specifically been recommending for use with its Alder Lake CPUs. It is a feature that helps to improve the security of your system against certain types of exploits or attacks. However, it has a performance cost. This is standard, where you trade off some of the performance for security. It's something we've seen a lot, especially following Spectre and Meltdown. But in this instance, Intel is recommending its use for Alder Lake, despite making it look potentially a little bit worse in comparisons. That's how you know that it is, at least in theory, a useful or desirable feature, or something that Intel has planned for. Now, the reason you should care about VBS, learning a little more about it, is because as we and other reviewers continue to test Windows 11 and 10 until there's a firm switchover point, you're going to hear VBS referenced in methodology sections, in explanations of why performance characteristics were a certain way, why performance might be lower or higher in some applications than otherwise expected. VBS will be a root cause of that. It'll be referenced frequently, so you should know what it is. So VBS then, let's talk about that. It's a high-level concept. It means using hardware-based virtualization to provide a layer of separation between a region of the memory, as in system memory, RAM, and the operating system. That is the core function. In Windows 10 and 11, there's a VBS feature known as Hypervisor Protected Code Integrity, or HVCI, and this is available on both OSs. It utilizes Microsoft's Hyper-V. That comes with the extra performance cost that we talked about, but the amount of the performance that it costs to have running depends on the application. VBS is to some extent an OS level feature in that you can enable and disable it in Windows 11 and 10. But 11 is the central point here. So it's an OS level feature. It is, however, influenced elsewhere. So it's influenced by the CPU, which has to support it, and it's influenced by the BIOS, at least to some extent from what we've seen so far, which needs certain features enabled by default or by the user in order to enable VBS. In Windows 10, this feature has always been off by default. In Windows 11, however, according to Microsoft's official documentation, the feature described as memory integrity in the settings menu is enabled by default, and that's specifically for clean installs, and that's clean installs on Intel 11th gen or newer, 11 or 12, or AMD Zen 2 or newer. So for clean installs with those CPU architectures, products on them, VBS will be enabled with Windows 11 by default. There are a couple of other requirements, however, for it to be enabled by default. One of them is 8 GB or more of system memory, and the other one is 64 GB or more of solid-state storage. These are the items that Microsoft says can trigger or will trigger VBS being on by default. HVCI compatible drivers are also required, and virtualization is required to be enabled in BIOS. If it is off by default in BIOS, it will appear as if the motherboard either doesn't support it, or to you as an end user in the OS, or it will appear as if VBS is off by default, because although the OS has the toggle to turn it on by default, the motherboard is restricting its ability to flip that toggle. So that's the explanation for that. The default behavior for clean installs was confirmed in early October, actually, by a statement from Underwriters Laboratories to PC Gamer. For our normal Windows 10 testing, the ones where we use the results as a baseline for the review and publish them with our original Alder Lake reviews, VBS was left disabled, as it always has been in our tests. Our Strix Z690E gaming Wi-Fi test system satisfied all of the VBS requirements listed, so VBS was enabled for our one-off Alder Lake Windows 11 tests, as we reported in our Windows 11 versus 10 benchmarking. So none of that's really news. That was already in our Windows 10 versus 11 benchmarks, the part about how we do the testing. That is known, but just including it again in case you skipped that video. The rest of this, however, we haven't really talked about in as much depth, so let's keep going. So anyway, this all matches Intel's own internal testing. Intel itself wanted to enable an option that hurts its performance on its precious Windows 11 that it so desperately wants to promote. Definitely not a co-marketing deal. That's because there's value in it. There's also security. So VBS is useful, at least if you're cynical for any other reason. Intel wanting something on where performance gets hurt as a result is maybe a key driver that this is, in fact, a good thing. We were fine leaving it enabled in our Windows 11 testing, especially when it's default behavior, and it addresses the litany of security issues publicized in the last few years. So here's where we see some differences. What you see as an end user will differ a little bit based on what kind of system you're setting up. The same goes for other reviewers as you watch other reviews, and people have potentially different settings from each other. VBS has been inconsistent between the manufacturers, so motherboards, and between Windows installs. Not every Windows install is the same. Clean Windows installs more or less are, but that's not the only way to install Windows 11. Now, as far as motherboard support, although we don't have any boards that featured a setting where VBS was disabled by default, our understanding is that there are boards where VBS will look disabled by default because of a motherboard setting. We only have two Z690 boards, by the way, so we haven't tested a whole lot of them. But our understanding is that there is a setting in BIOS where if it is configured in an incorrect or perhaps against Intel guidance fashion, at least maybe not incorrect in that sense, then VBS will be off. So motherboards will change the setting. Additionally, the VBS toggle is inherited when you are upgrading a system. If you're upgrading from Windows 10 to Windows 11, then the setting will be inherited. If it was off by default because you never changed it, it's going to be off in your Windows 11 install because you upgraded rather than doing a clean install. That's fine. Personally speaking, I don't like upgrading my systems, my personal systems, from one Windows to the other. I would always do a clean install because I had bad experiences with it where it just gets buggy and weird over time and bloated. But if you want to upgrade, that's fine. Just be aware of the VBS change. For reviews, we only do clean installs. So Windows 10, clean installs, Windows 11, clean installs, and we isolate the install disks, the install SSDs for every platform, every system to keep everything clean. So that means that VBS in our tests is on by default because the system meets all of the requirements and because the install is fresh rather than an upgrade. Now, there are completely logical reasons for using VBS on or off as either an end user or as a much smaller audience, a reviewer. Just like there are logical reasons for using Windows 10 or using Windows 11 right now. So I guess what we're trying to say is as long as those reasons are stated and everyone's on the same page, then it doesn't really matter. Kind of like going back to the power limit settings with all the previous Intel generations where we've always said we set the Intel official guidance power limits, which means the more restricted power limits. So the worst of the multiple scenario options for Intel platforms because Intel recommends those settings and because the motherboard manufacturers who are following guidance will use those settings rather than blasting maximum power all the time to max out the turbo all the time, which starts to look like it's in violation of the Intel spec, even though technically it's not a spec. If you're going to be pedantic about it, it's official guidance that they print on a spec sheet. But either one's fine as a tester, as long as it's stated. Intel marketing perhaps notwithstanding in that instance, or motherboard marketing. But as a tester, as a reviewer, as long as the audience is on the same page, then it's all good to test with either of those. Same goes for Windows 10 and 11, same goes for VBS, but hopefully everyone has a better understanding of what that is now and why it's there, and what the default settings are supposed to be depending on the platform. All right, DRM issues up next. This is fun because DRM is something that everybody can universally hate, except for Denuvo, or at least the people who own the company. But DRM, or digital rights management, which is the enemy of all enemies for background processes, not counting maybe antivirus software like Norton, is something that has influenced the Alder Lake CPUs and their ability to launch certain games. This is a known issue. We talked about this in our initial reviews. In our first review, the 12900K, we talked about how Total War 3 Kingdoms would not go past the menu. It wouldn't play the games. And at the time when we published the review, we weren't sure why that was. It wasn't until later when Intel released a statement, when some of you in the comments started pointing out the statements, that we realized it was actually related to this DRM issue. Intel says that the issue is root caused to the E cores, or the efficient cores, which DRM software, Intel says, can sometimes misrecognize as another system entirely, thus preventing the games from running. Shortly after launch day reviews went up, Intel posted an official statement entitled List of Games Affected by DRM Issue. Intel said the following, quote, "The games listed below are impacted by the DRM issue on the 12th gen Intel Core processors, causing games to crash or not load in Windows 11 and or Windows 10. The games listed below in bold are expected to be patched sometime in mid-November with the upcoming Windows 11 update. We are working with developers to resolve issues with the rest of the games listed. In the meantime, the scroll lock workaround can be used for these games," and we'll talk about that in a moment. Intel goes on to list 22 games. We'll put those on the screen. At least it was 22 at the time of writing the script. And that's affected for Windows 11 and Windows 10. Those games, to be clear, are dysfunctional in one way or another. Either they crash, or they won't launch, or they won't get past the menu like ours did. Intel then continues to list an additional 28 games that are affected on Windows 10 only, totaling 50 games. And we'll put those up as well. Now, of course, Intel suggests that this list can be remedied by upgrading to Windows 11, the latter list that is, the former can't, but that's not really a solution as much as it is a workaround. Intel also suggests the scroll lock workaround, which involves enabling a new BIOS switch called Legacy Game Compatibility Mode and toggling the scroll lock key on when running those games. Scroll lock can be disabled after the fact. This is probably about the closest Intel or Microsoft will ever get to saying DRM is horrible without outright saying it. But DRM is horrible, we can say it. And the way it's run is it's often an abuse of power and an abuse of the fact that someone has paid money and is now being held hostage to use the software a specific way that starts to infringe on the way they use the rest of their computers. One thing if you want to say, if you play this game, you have to let our anti-cheat software run in the background when you're playing the game. It's another thing to say our anti-cheat software is running constantly, all the time, and is there at boot, whether or not you even launch your game client in this session of Windows. So that's the list of the DRM stuff. Total War 3 Kingdoms was on one of those lists. I think it was the second list. And the updates are, in theory, rolling out. But it sounds like Windows 11 will be potentially better supported here going forward. Not really a big surprise, but they are supposed to be updating it for both platforms. Time to talk about BIOS and power limits. With previous Intel CPUs, there have been 3 important numbers that affect boost behavior: power limit 1, or PL1, power limit 2, and tau. There are more power limits, there are more time settings and time durations, but those are the primary features of an Intel CPU. AMD does not work the same way. It has its own and different parameters under which it operates. So PL2 is the high power limit. It's the upper end of what Intel is ever going to run at without overclocking or manual input. And PL2 is where it will run for the duration of tau. Tau, TAU, is a number of seconds at which the CPU will boost, turbo boost, maximally to power limit 2. After these seconds expire, after tau expires, as we say, which is, from memory, it's 56 seconds. After that 56-second window, by default Intel guidance, the CPU will drop down to PL1. PL1 is almost always aligned with Intel's claimed TDP. So if you're using a CPU that claims a 125 watt TDP, for example, like the upper end 11K SKU CPUs, then what will happen is you might run at 200 watts, maybe even 250 watts during PL2. You will continue to run that way until tau expires, which under official Intel guidance is less than a minute. And at that point, it will drop down to 125 in this example. So at that point, you're basically one-to-one with Intel claimed TDP in a spec sheet to power consumed at the EPS 12-volt cables, not factoring out VRM efficiency losses. We're not going to go over this whole part of it again. We have 1 year per video going over this basically, but Intel's guidance is just guidance. It's just recommendations. They're strong ones, but the recommendations to motherboard manufacturers who often ignore them in an effort to clamor over each other to get to the top of the couple of charts that still get created where it's a list of motherboards benchmarked against each other. Basically what you're looking at in those lists is a list of motherboard default settings. It's not who's best. It's not who has the best engineering. It's not really who has the best thermals or anything else. It's who allows the most power to blast into the CPU, which it's got upsides, but also has a lot of downsides. So anyway, the motherboard manufacturers are free to ignore that and often do. Some of them follow it. ASUS has been the most consistent in following it, or at least giving you a clear option at first boot to follow official guidance, which would mean a lower cooler requirement, for example, and then you could boost it later if you wanted to. So we always apply these recommended limits, and that's what they are. They are limits for stock testing. To be clear, that's because it's closest to the Intel spec that is listed online. ASUS, as an example, again, typically has an option of F1 or F2 when you boot up to run with the Intel guidance versus the maximum power limit that will be allowed. So with Intel Alder Lake, things have changed. PL1 equals PL2 is new official policy. That means they're the same. So the power limit 2, the high limit of 241 watts on a 12900K can be maintained indefinitely. There's no significant change or change at all oftentimes in the clock speed when tau expires here unless the user manually tunes the power limits. There's still a cap, but it's high. And note that the 2 brands of Z690 board that we've tested thus far, that'd be MSI and ASUS, continue to happily ignore the recommendations by default, so nothing has changed on that end. MSI especially here is guilty. We had to change a number of settings to get to what they should be for our DDR4 versus 5 testing because they were screwing around with power limits and things like that. As a one-off aside here too, vCore will greatly affect the power consumption and of course the temperature in massive ways. In the past we've done reporting and videos talking about how a high temperature CPU can often be made to look like high temperature, and technically is, just because vCore is blasted way higher than necessary to maintain a frequency often that is MCE'd into existence. So that's a separate issue, but you may be able to fine-tune vCore down to drop the power consumption, drop the cooler requirement, drop the temperature, and or drop the noise level in accordance. Thermal velocity boost, meanwhile, is if you don't know, quoting Intel, it's the feature that opportunistically and automatically increases clock frequency above single-core and multi-core Intel Turbo Boost technology frequencies based on how much the processor is operating below its maximum temperature. Also involves whether turbo budget's available. Now, what this really means is it's a dumb toggle, not in an insulting way, but in a technology way, of is the CPU below threshold 70 degrees Celsius? If yes, add 100 megahertz to boost. If no, don't add 100 megahertz to boost, and that's really as simple as it is. TVB has changed though. For the moment, it appears it is Dunsky. That's right, TVB is Dunsky. There are TVB related settings in BIOS, but we haven't played with them yet. Intel's official statement is that, quote, this feature is not validated on the 12th gen Intel Core platform. We continue to evaluate it for future products. That might be a marketing or a PR move. It might be because getting the CPUs below the 12900K, especially below 70C, is a bit of a challenge, at least out of box. It may be because the power consumption was already so high that tacking on another boost for 100 megahertz maybe wasn't worth it. Could also be that they're at about the limit for reasonable boost, or the binning wasn't good enough widespread across the CPUs. Or it could just genuinely be that they haven't validated it because they did other stuff instead. In any case, it is not presently available. So as a final note on BIOS settings, when we noticed when updating the out-of-box BIOS on our motherboards here, the ASUS Z690 especially, the board had an option that showed up to enable AVX 512 with the E cores disabled, so using P cores only. This is something that AnandTech followed up and confirmed as Intel went back and forth on whether AVX 512 would be supported at all and whether it was fused off at a hardware level. The final verdict, nope, it's there. It's not fused off. You can use it if you really want to. Quick thing on cooler alignment and spacing here. We've seen some commentary on coolers and the alignment of the cold plate on top of the IHS. This is not so simple as just saying coolers that don't quite cover the IHS are no good. It's not as simple as saying that certain parts of the cooler need to be aligned over certain parts of the silicon to achieve optimal performance. We've seen with Ryzen, for example, with Zen multi-chiplet designs that it's not that simple. Sometimes a cooler can just brute force its way to still being good, still being relevant, just because it's designed well overall, even if it's not designed specifically to target chiplet locations on something like a 3800X versus a 3950X where you go from 2 chiplets to 3 chiplets. So not always that simple. It's the same here too. Intel has a bigger IHS this time, integrated heat spreader, than it has in the past. And that means the coolers that really ride that line and run a little bit too small to begin with previous generations will be definitely in the too small camp for this one. They might still work. They can maybe brute force it with a fast enough fan, but it's going to be suboptimal. The line between suboptimal and usable, or unusable at least, is not thin. It's pretty obvious once you're in unusable territory. However, if you're trying to transplant something, you could always try using it first and adapting it with the official kit. And if it sucks and it's terrible and it's not going to work, then you get a new cooler. But that's the benefit with coolers, is it's a relatively simple technology. It's copper and a fan, so it's easy to give it a shot, see if it's not good enough. And if you'd like to do that, we would recommend Hardware Info 64 for getting a base CPU gauge. It'll tell you temperatures averaged overall across the silicon. So basic things to know here. Covering the whole IHS is ideal. If you do this, you are increasing the contact patch. This matters significantly more as the CPU gets hotter. If you're overclocking or if you're running a 12900K at say 240 watts, having that full coverage will matter a lot more than it'll matter on a 120 watt CPU where doesn't need as much heat soak ability. It doesn't need as much soak capacity from the cooling solution that is atop the IHS. So that's the first thing to know. If you're running the hotter of the CPUs or you're overclocking manually to higher power consumption, ultimately that's all this comes down to. Temperature is just an arbitrary scale, at least as we represent it in degrees Celsius, away from the base metric, and you're talking about energy ultimately. You can't compare AMD and Intel CPUs for degrees Celsius internal die temperature because each of the companies has hundreds of sensors that are spread across the die, measure different things, measure different ways, report different ways. So you can't compare those, but you can compare the power consumption. So then for cooler shopping, really what makes the most sense is at least full coverage of the IHS is preferred, not 100% required, but it is what we would recommend. And then don't worry too much about marketing about covering certain parts of the core better than the others. These things don't run hot enough to really matter for the most part because if it's a good cooling solution on the 10 series and it's got a big enough IHS, it will probably remain a good cooling solution here with the exception of one thing, which is the mount. If the mount has gotten worse, if the standoffs are the wrong height, like the original round of Corsair standoffs we got for Alder Lake, which were the wrong height, then it's going to be a lot worse. The pressure might not be right. The Z height, the spacing might not be right where you end up floating a little bit over the IHS. That's something where the cooler is not necessarily flawed, but the mounting solution is. So simple stuff applies as always, but when you mount it, try to slightly wiggle the cooler. Don't put a lot of force into it to force it to move because then you're going to be remounting it. But try to move it a little bit. And if it's an AIO, make sure you're moving the entire pump block and housing, not just the bracket, the ring around it. If it wiggles substantially, then it's not mounted well. Either that's your fault or it's the mounting kit is just not good, not right for it. And that's the main thing to look out for is mounting kits that were rushed through to the market. PCIe Gen5. Finally, we saw a few comments asking about PCIe Gen5. Its technical inclusion on Alder Lake. Keyword here is technical. It's there, it's not doing anything, at least not today, not with our test platform. So PCIe Gen5, like any other interface protocol or interconnect, has one defining feature, which is going to be speed, at least as marketing would have it. Speed, however, needs another counterpart, which is a device to receive or operate at that speed. If both devices do not have the same maximum theoretical speed, then they will drop to transferring at the rate of speed by the slowest of the two devices. If you have a 10 gigabit Ethernet cable, for example, it shouldn't be a surprise that you're only able to download at 100 megabits per second when either the series of tubes providing your internet is limited to 100 megabits per second, or perhaps there's another limiter, like the servers that are providing the download. So it doesn't matter if it's 10 GBE if there's another limiter. The same goes for hard drives, the same goes for GPUs. I think almost all of you know this. There are always new people in the audience, so I wanted to explain it just in case someone's like, I don't get it. Why doesn't Gen 5 PCIe matter if it can operate at a theoretical 64 gigabytes per second instead of 32 with PCIe Gen 4? That's a lot faster. So does it help me? The answer is no, not today. And that's because a few things. The GPUs currently on the market for consumers are PCIe Gen 4. There are no PCIe Gen 5 enabled GPUs that you can buy to put in your gaming computer or your computer in general. Additionally, the GPUs, even if we pretend they had PCIe Gen 5 capabilities, do not exceed the current PCIe Gen 4 bandwidth, at least for the wide variety of applications that any of us would use or test. There might be a couple outliers there that sort of pin the GPU in just a specific way, but for the most part, it's fair to say that existing GPUs do not really exceed PCIe Gen 4 by 16 bandwidth to the extent that PCIe Gen 5 in the theoretical world where it is present and working on a GPU that is socketable today would be beneficial. So no, it doesn't really help today. And it certainly doesn't affect the performance in benchmarks as were published recently, because it's not a thing. So it's ready for a future thing, but it's not a thing today. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching as always. Hopefully that answers a couple of key questions about Alder Lake. If you're new to this stuff, check out the channel for reviews. If you've been here a while, stick around because we've got some cool things coming up. And as always, you can go to store.gamersnexus.net if you'd like to grab one of our mod mats for building PCs or one of our toolkits on back order. You can also go to patreon.com/gamersnexus. Thank you for watching. We'll see you all next time.